Hi everybody. For the last few weeks I've been working on a node-based shader editor for Unity 3. What I'm going to do is give you a quick rundown on how it works, and I hope to have a beta out by the end of the week. So when I do, download it and have a go. What I'm going to do to start with is just load a shader graph I created earlier. This is a very simple shader graph that just samples a 2D texture and then applies that color output to the color of the shader. As you can see here on the left, there's a master node. This maps to the Unity 3 surface description for their shaders, and basically this means it will work with both the deferred and forward rendering systems, and it's quite simple to use and will automatically support shadows and the like. What we have here on the right hand side is a texture input or a sampler 2D input. By clicking on the node you can actually define the name of the texture you want to come in. What I'm going to do is just rename it to texture and set the default color to black. Whenever you change a default value or a value on an input parameter, you need to recompile the shader, so we'll just do that now quickly by clicking update shader. And as you can see in the preview pane, we now have a black sphere because there's no color being applied to it. The preview pane is updated in real time, so when we start to do funky stuff with time nodes and the like, you'll actually see this pane be updated in real time. So by actually clicking on it, it gives you a view of all the inputs to the shader, which can be overridden in real time without needing to recompile the shader. So what we're going to do is we're just going to override that sampler 2D that we've put in with this fireball texture. Now, as you can see, it's quite simple. We've just input a texture 2D, sampled it, and put the color out. What we're going to do now is something a bit more exciting. We're going to pan this texture around the sphere using a UV pan node. What the UV pan node does is it takes a time and a UV input, and it then basically uses that time to pan the UV channel. So as you can see here, the output from the sampler 2D UV now goes into the UV pan input, and the result then is what we use to sample with. What we need now is a time node. Now this is the same as the Unity shader input time node, or time value I should say. So it has 4 components. What we want to do is we want to use the X component, which is time divided by 20. And then we're going to pan on the U channel, which is the X. Now, since we've added a new input and modified the shader quite extensively, it requires us to update the shader as it's telling us here. So we'll now update the shader. You will then see the preview panel gets updated and that texture is being panned around on the surface. Now, we're going to do something a little more complex. We're going to add a specular parameter to this shader. So what we're going to do is we're going to input a specular color and put that into the gloss of the material. Now we're going to give it a nice default red color. We're just going to leave its input name as color 0 for the time being. And then we also need to specify a specular power, so we're going to use a range node and put that in here into specular. We're going to specify a minimum value of 0.1 and a maximum value of 1 on this, and as you can see, you can just basically scroll the default value using the range slider. So we'll just leave it at 5.6 for the time being, and then update the shader. Now, quite simply, you can see that the preview panel has 2 lights, so there's 2 specular highlights now on the sphere. Now, this material system that I've developed also supports transparency out of the box, so you don't need to do anything funky with a generated shader to get transparency to work. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug in an alpha value into the master. We're going to use the alpha from the texture 2D sample because we can use that as a mask for the shader or an alpha value. So what we're going to do is, as all the outputs in this system are float 4s, we're essentially going to splat the alpha component onto all 4 values of a vector. So we'll just splat W, and then we'll input that value here into alpha. What that will do is it means that the output vector from the splat is basically the .www from the texture sample. So then the alpha can just sample that because that's just a single float. So now once we update that shader, as you can see, we now have a nice transparent portion on that sphere. Now, because we've added these extra values, once we click on the preview panel, you can actually change them in real time because they're passed into the shader. So we could say, for example, make the specular highlight a blue color. You can't quite see it because there we are, just a tiny bit there, because it's being chopped off by most of the alpha. And you can also specify the specular value there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to export this shader, and then I can show you how it works in the Unity engine itself. So you simply just click on the export button, and then that'll export into a shader. So I'll just export it to shader test here. Oh, actually, I need to give it a name first. So it'll go into graph output. I might change this to editor test. So we're going to export that to here, to shader test.shader. Let's replace that. And now I'm going to just jump to here. So as you can see, I have a scene here with a sphere that has no texture on it currently. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, here it is. It's the generated shader. It has no texture. We can put that texture on it. And then once we click play, you'll be able to see it rotate in the editor. Yeah, so that's it simply. You can also do some other interesting things, like save the shader out so you can load it up later, and lots of other things. It also supports error checking. So for example, if I name this input color 0 and this input color 0 as well, it will detect that there's a clash on input names, and it'll actually warn on both those nodes, so you can debug your shader graph. Yeah, beta out at the end of the week. I hope you all download it and have a go. Thanks.